Welcome to Green and Red, scrappy politics for scrappy people. A regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics. Brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. And as always, I'm joined by...
Today I'm in...
Bob's ahead of himself.
I'm ahead of himself. I'm in a different time zone, so, it's like a virtual thing. I'm in the Montrose in Houston on a pretty nice day, and I'm, glad to be here. As always, thank you. We've done some great shows recently too. We've had on Noam Chomsky a month ago. We just did a fantastic show on the Cuban Missile Crisis, like really digging down and showing you what really happened there, breaking the myths of Kennedy and so forth. Talked to Mike Elk live from Brazil yesterday. Done a lot of great environmental work. So we're really on kind of ramping up our game. And you're watching this right now, most likely, or you're listening to it. Please hit that share button. It'll take like a nanosecond. Subscribe, tell people about it, support us in any way you can. We really do appreciate it. And so to begin today, I want to say something to Scott. Michelle Obama said, when they go low, we go high. So I want to know, what is the official Green and Red position on that?
Yeah, we think that's a bad idea. Or we don't necessarily agree with that. We also don't, know what the real point of that statement is. Yeah. I do before we jump the episode, I just want to throw out that, folks, if you want to support the Green and Red podcast, go to greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button, or go to our Patreon page, become a patron at patreon.com/greenandredpodcast. I also want to say that we have these calendars that we've bought from our friends at the Certain Days Collective. We bought 10 at a rate. And our goal is to give the 10 away for a generous donation to the Green and Red podcast. And so if you want to support the Green and Red podcast, get a political prisoner calendar called 2023 Certain Days. Our friend Daniel McGowan, who's been on the show a couple of times as part of this crew, just email us at greenandredpodcast@gmail.com, and we will send you one and figure it all out. So with that, we'll just take it away from here. Just a real quick background. We're about a week before the 2022 midterm elections. There's a media frenzy right now about the red wave, the election's going to break for the Republicans. We're not really here to make any predictions because, we're always wrong in our predictions, or we're often right in our predictions. But then if we are wrong, we don't want to get caught, saying that we're wrong. So what we do want to talk about, however, is the both, vicious way in which the Democratic Party, not the Republicans are vicious too, but the vicious way in which the Democrats respond when they're in a losing situation. And we're going to talk a lot about that. Then we're also going to talk about what we consider to be their ineptitude. And so last month when we had Noam Chomsky on, we talked about the last 50 years of Democratic leadership. We talked about the vicious class war in which the Democrats have been a party to on the working class, on the labor movement. And we also talk about how there's just been this failure to organize any sort of real resistance. And so we're going to be sort of taking that part away. Taking that apart. I'm not speaking very well today. Too much coffee, I think. We just want to flag that when in power, the Democrats actually are the ones waging the class war. And when the GOP is in power, they are saying that there's a class war, but then are also pretty much party to waging it. And we particularly saw that during the Clinton and Obama years. We saw that We talked about that a lot with Noam Chomsky last month. And so we're going to be just talking about that. I'm kind of rambling, so I'm going to just hand it off to Bob for a minute.
First, sorry for jumping the gun on that segue. We talked to Chomsky about this, and what we've seen is like 50 years now of Democratic backpedaling, along with the failure of the Democratic Party, of labor, of NGOs to offer any kind of real resistance. And in the absence of that, we've seen this incredible move to the right, beginning in the 1960s and 70s, and accelerating. And every time the Republicans, who are irredeemable, that's why we don't really attack them very much. And I will make predictions about the election, by the way. It's going to be bad for the Democrats. There's my prediction. But and so what we want to do, and this is something we've talked about before, we're not like kind of breaking a whole lot of new ground here. But in the week before the election, I think it's important to do this, even if it doesn't come out before the elections are over. We're taping it, a week before that. And I think it's important to kind of discuss this again, because when the election's over, you're going to kind of get the hand wringing and the accusations and all that kind of stuff coming from the Democratic Party. And our basic premise is that the Republican Party is vicious and they're awful, and they own, much of what's gone on. But the Democratic parties have been co-conspirators in all this too. And until liberals and people who consider themselves left or whatever attack the Democrats and actually have an analysis which brings the Democrats' culpability into, kind of the foreground, then nothing's going to change. And that's why I made the kind of semi-joke about Michelle Obama saying, when they go low, we go high, because that's obviously been the way the Democrats have handled this for a long time. And it's obviously been an absolutely utter failure. And I think we're seeing that again. The Democratic Party's offered a kind of a milder version of the worst excesses of the Republican Party. They've embraced neoliberalism. We've talked about that before, beginning with Jimmy Carter. And they tend to hang their hats on issues like diversity and identity and stuff like that, rather than actual materialist or class politics. So we have this bitter, brutal, and disgusting irony of the Republican Party, which really doesn't hide its own, class interest. It's talking about gutting Social Security and lowering taxes on rich people and so forth. But they've also assumed the mantle of kind of defending the working class. And the Democratic Party has kind of sat back and really had no effective response. They've been paralyzed, even though this has happened again and again and again and again, which is why, we call them the Washington Generals of American politics. And I don't know where Scott wants to start. So I think at some point, I don't know if you want to start with this, we want to talk about the 2000 elections, because I think that's really a kind of a watershed in a lot of this stuff. But
just a couple of real quick frames I want to throw out there. One is, we haven't seen the sort of, we've seen pockets of resistance, and we see moments of resistance, and sometimes it's even militant. Like definitely in the 1930s and the 1960s, we saw some serious militancy. We don't see that in these political institutions at all. And anyone who tries to make a move towards any sort of even like a nod to militant groups that are on the outside of these institutions. I'm talking about like just recently, like the movement for Black Lives and defunding the police, is that the establishment and the leadership of the Democratic Party like kill that. They nix it. Like there's very little support. There's like it's attack. And it's, as we've titled this episode, punch left. Also, we see Bernie Sanders, who Noam Chomsky says if he was in Europe, he'd probably be a Christian Democrat, is seen as this outlier with socialist politics because he also identifies as a democratic socialist. Same with AOC. They, once again, they punch left, but there's no real militant resistance like we've seen in previous years. There is pockets of it, not within the institutions, but there is pockets of it outside of the institutions. I want to just draw. I want to say a quote from one of our favorite commentators from the past, which is Gore, who once quipped that America has one party with two right wings, and that's actually a very accurate description of the American political system. The other thing I want to point out is just in like recent history, we're seeing a lot more militant resistance on the streets in other parts of the world. And two of my favorite stories, one actually is from this week, is in Colombia in 2019 when there were all these protests against like austerity, neoliberalism, and the oppressive police state in Colombia. In Colombia, there was a student march, which was actually pretty viciously attacked by riot police, kind of the same stuff we saw in 2020. The next day, the students actually marched to the police commander's house and set it on fire, right? That's like a certain level of militancy that we don't see in the United States. And it's definitely not anything that's sort of acceptable within these like more conservative institutions. The other happened this week where we saw the supporters of Bolsonaro who were in the 2 days which Bolsonaro was like silent and we weren't sure whether he was going to concede and give up the presidency. Supporters of Bolsonaro were blocking highways in the southern part of Brazil. I believe Mike Elk talked about this in his talk with Bob the other day. We saw marches from the favelas and steel workers, et cetera, go and break up those blockades, right? You don't see that sort of thing. And those there's a lot of integration that happens in between like movements and political institutions in other parts of the world. I would actually say there's a lot of integration between like right-wing movements and right-wing politicians in this country. We don't see that in the sort of like what's the left liberal labor sort of institutions supporting like movement on the street. So just like two important frames for what we talk about today.
Similar to Gore Vidal's observation, La Raza Unida in Colorado in the 60s described the Democrats and Republicans as a two-headed pig eating from the same trough. So, and I think something else that I'd like to add to your point about militancy, because I think it's actually worse. In the summer of 2020 is really instructive because that was this immense, probably arguably the largest in US history, 25 million people in the streets. And it had support. It was supported. 54% of Americans supported burning down the precinct in Minneapolis. Defunding the police had significant support. Black Lives Matter had significant support. And corporations understood that, and the ruling class understood that and acted accordingly, right? And they actually created grave problems for Donald Trump. It was the Democrats who, as soon as that phrase, defund the police, came out, a phrase that had popular support, a phrase that was being explained, right? Because the Republicans are going to, explain it in their own way, and we can talk about campaign advertising here in Texas, especially if we have a few minutes later. But the Republicans are going to kind of put their own spin on this and really, muck up what it really means. But people involved in the defund movement were explaining it. It was supported. Black Lives Matter was supported. Americans were seeing on their screens, on their phones, every single day, brutal scenes of police attacking protesters, not just African Americans, not just Antifa, walls of moms, 75-year-old guy in Buffalo, right? And it was the Democrats, it was the Democratic Party who immediately came and said, oh, we can't talk about defending the police. We're going to give more money to the police, right? And they flipped it. And you have kind of Democratic officers like the incredibly odious Roy Teixeira, who, is still beating that drum, Thomas Byrne Edsel, and they attack what they call the Democratic left, right? And, remember after those elections, you had, you sent me the article yesterday, the woman from Virginia, Abigail Spanberger, who, was just, she barely won, squeaked by in 2020 and said, I don't ever want to hear about defund the police. I don't ever want to hear about the Green New Deal. I don't ever want to hear about socialism again, because the Republicans had very cleverly, kind of raised those issues and the Democrats had no response to them. And so, that stuck. So even when resistance does occur, it's the Democrats who co-opt it. The Republicans, you could call defund the police. Let's give everybody free whiskey and ice cream and send a few fewer dollars to the police. And they'd still attack it. It doesn't matter. The Democrats are caught up on all these performative things and these words and images. And so I think that's what we're seeing here now. And this is why, they're lost. They can't do anything. And so they kind of ultimately they're going to always punch left. And I mentioned earlier, and you can go back beyond this, but I want to start with the election of 2000, because I think in this contemporary times, this occurred just a couple of years after the GOP impeached Bill Clinton. It was, only the third impeachment in history at the time on some really spurious issues. I mean, the actual charge was perjury, but it involved a fling with a young intern, an affair with a young intern, which nobody in politics had ever gone, touched before, because everybody in Washington, D.C. does that. And so on the heels of that, the election of 2000 came up, and you want to talk about a stolen election, that really was one. We don't have,
it was one that was worked.
and it worked, and I think that's why the Cheneys hate Trump so much, because he screwed it all up, right? He mucked up the memory of a good election steal. But that election was stolen. You had the Brooks Brothers riot. The Republicans owned the streets. They owned the courts, and that's worth mentioning, because the Democratic Party for a long time has relied on the courts rather than on political organizing or laws or anything like that. And they stole that election. And in the aftermath of the election of 2000, what did the Democrats do? Who did they blame? First of all, Gore acquiesced. He conceded. He rejected offers to do street demonstrations from Jesse Jackson and others to kind of counter the Brooks Brothers riot. So he rejected that. He wouldn't.
And labor, Florida labor councils, etc.
Yeah, so they rejected that. He acquiesced. He meekly, went into that good night. And who did they blame? Who to this day is still blamed for Al Gore's election loss in 2000?
The third party candidate, Green Party candidate, Ralph Nader.
Ralph Nader, who's done more to help average people than the entire Democratic Party apparatus, the apparatchiks combined, right? And to this day, liberals still are venomous about Ralph Nader. And so there was no analysis, no self-critique of Al Gore, who lost his home state. If he won his home state, he would have won the election. He lost New Hampshire, he lost Arkansas, Bill Clinton's home state. None of that. It was all because of Ralph Nader.
If he had won any of those three,
he's president.
He would have been president.
Yeah.
Things
the
last 22 years probably would have been different.
Yeah, a little bit. Probably not as much as we think. Anyway, so I think that that's kind of in the more recent and more contemporary times, that election of 2000, really. I mean, we've done other shows where we've gone back and we've shown you campaign ads from Barry Goldwater's 1964 campaign and Nixon's 1968 campaign and Reagan. This is not a new phenomenon. We've been really explicit and consistent in pointing out Donald Trump is not some new creature, this unicorn who kind of came out of nowhere. He follows a tried and true pattern. I mean, Trump is Dick Cheney, but without the brains and without the guile and all that kind of stuff. But the evil is there, but Trump is just a fucking idiot, right? Whereas Cheney, actually was deceptive and duplicitous in an intelligent way, right? So that's kind of that's how we got to this point. And from there, we saw the attacks on Obama, the birther movement, stealing a Supreme Court appointment, the rhetoric about death panels and all this kind of stuff. And in the face of all this, the Democrats just don't really do anything. And so I think that's to some degree how we got to this point where we are now, which is, I think, facing a really ugly election next week. And again, to point out, and then I'll toss it to you because I want to make this point because we say it all the time. And I think it's important because we don't want people attacking us and saying we're Democratic Party hacks or whatever. Like we're not thrilled about electoral politics as a main organizing tool. Liberals focus on that almost to the exclusion of everything else. There's not a whole lot of street activity. There's not a whole lot of activism. People focus on elections as not a tactic, but the tactic. They focus on electoral politics. And we don't believe in that. At the same time, it's a tactic. And since there's no real resistance going on, there are pockets of, like you pointed out, but there's no mass resistance going on. In the 1930s, you had mass resistance on a consistent and decent. I mean, in Ohio, I talked to some of the old men I talked to, when I was a kid, I talked to old timers who were in the little steel strike. There's nothing like that going on. You do have a rush of labor organizing at Amazon and Starbucks, and that's very cool, but it ain't the little steel strike, right? It's not like the WAP, it's not like the CIO or any of that kind of stuff, or even the 60s, right? So in the absence of that, then elections are actually important, right? And so the fact that the GOP is likely, certain to take over the House, and I think probably will take the Senate as well, bodes ill for any kind of even tiny progressive movement, or it bodes ill for groups which want to be protected, like in some cases physically protected from violence. I mean, here in Texas, at LGBTQ, drag queen weedings and LGBTQ events, these batshit crazy right wingers are out there with their AR-15s, and and so it's a fairly serious thing.
In some states, there's sitting in front of like early drop-off ballot boxes with their AR-15s.
Yeah, in fact, although in Arizona, a federal judge, a Trump appointee yesterday, said that they can't have guns and they can't take photos and they have to stay a certain distance away. So it's a minor thing. Actually, I mean, maybe I'm saying this to some degree to be, kind of, it's hyperbolic, but I think Trump judges have done more than the Democrats. So
yeah, it's true. And well, we've had shows on how Trump appointees and his administration did more than the Democrats do.
Yeah.
The other thing, just to kind of like where we're going with this is it's this sort of like performative, resistance. And it's like it became like a joke in the Trump years, the hashtag resistance. And the only response that we see is, quote unquote, vote harder, right? Vote like it's the vote like it's the, like your life depends on it. And then we see a lot of like, this is the most important election ever. They'll overturn Roe versus Wade. They overturned Roe versus Wade. They're coming for your Social Security, I think is the buzz phrase of the week. And the liberal strategy is basically to donate and sign petitions. I just as a something I noticed, I actually was watching this new HBO show the other night called The White Lotus, and there's some characters who are these very much archetypal liberal sort of characters. And when another character asks them, well, what do you do for politics? And they're like, well, we vote and we always donate. And, I just like, that's like not enough. And, if it's the most important election ever, if it's fascism's taken over, if there's a coup coming, if, the right wing, which are probably going to do some like really terrible things as much as they can, especially if we see Marjorie Taylor Greene on committees and shit like that, then, why is the only solution to these terrible things, this fascist coup coming, to vote harder? There was a Michael Tomasky in the New Republic actually had a whole article recently about how the right wing is so terrible and the fascist wave is coming. And that's their words, not my words, right? But like his response, the solution to that is like, we just need to turn out in bigger numbers and vote. And I just want to like flag that like there's a whole lot more that we could be doing. And there's a whole lot more that some of us are doing, not just like ranting on a podcast, but there's like a lot of street activity that a lot of people are doing. And if we want to turn out numbers and get more people doing stuff, then let's get more people into the street like we saw in 2020.
And more people are voting. And turnout's not bad. In the last few years, you have young people turning out, you have registrations going up. The assumption here is that, everybody who's not voting would vote for liberals. Well, that's not necessarily true. There are probably a lot of people, who, it's a mixed sort. Look at the, Latinos in Texas, that was like, we need to get them out. Well, in fact, a lot of them are voting for Trump and voting for Republicans, right? So, there's an inherent problem with that too, but it's easy, to kind of, we're kind of dancing all over the place here. And I mentioned that the 2000 election. I think the events of January 6th, 2021 are important here too, because we all know what happened that day. And I'm bragging about myself, but that night, the night before, when Warner and Ossoff won those elections in Georgia to essentially give the Senate to the Democrats, I wrote this kind of a series of observations. The first one was, because it was the day before the electoral count, right? And I said, let's see. I said, tomorrow's charge up San Juan Hill, because you knew something was going to happen. Tomorrow's charge up San Juan Hill could be the greatest political gift ever for the Democratic Party, but we know that they're the Washington Generals of politics. So you can, I'm not a prophet, but you could kind of see it coming. And that's really, I think that election was really instructive in how the Democrats operate, because it was clear that Biden won that night, on the night of the election, and it was officially certified a couple of days later, right? Not certified, but it was, the media called and it was clear he'd won. At that point, the Democratic Party ceased all of the actions that were, kind of in effect for street demonstrations, for protests and so on, if Trump tried to kind of steal the election. And they went into hiding for the most part, and they absolutely conceded to Trump the entire narrative for the next 8 weeks. Nothing, no counter narrative, nothing. Trump going on and on, the big lie. This is a great fucking around in Georgia, doing all this stuff. And the Democratic Party sat there basically because we know we won, and they ceded that, right? And then, after that, it took them forever to form a January 6th committee. It took them forever to have hearings. It took them forever to subpoena Trump. And guess what? On January 6th, 2023, that committee's not going to exist. It's going to be disbanded, right, by the Republicans, right? Now, granted, they'll turn that stuff over to the Justice Department, but Merrick Garland ain't exactly got a fire under his ass either. So you were handed this incredible gift, of the president operating with Proud Boys and openly, white supremacists and engaging in violence, and you have the Secret Service likely involved in it. You have him not only going after people like Nancy Pelosi, but his own vice president, right? And nothing's come of it. Nothing's come of it. But it's a great performative thing. When you have those hearings, the liberals love it. They eat it up, right? You release that video of Nancy Pelosi on January 6th making phone calls, and they're just ecstatic. Don't you ever criticize her again. She's the freaking Speaker of the House. That's what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to get on the phone and talk to the National Guard, talk to the governors of Virginia and Maryland. Like, that's the minimum of what she should do. But they loved it because she said, "Oh, I'd punch him out if he was here." Like, Jesus. And she can rip up a speech, she can clap. This is what you have, and this is what they love. So that's my rant on that issue.
The other piece here is that they do this sort of performance, and a lot of their a lot of their strategy in 2020 was like, don't vote for Trump. Trump's evil, and granted, there was they tied him a lot to the failure of the response to the pandemic and all of that sort of stuff. But then they also don't actually campaign on like issues which are winning issues for them. And when we see things like healthcare, improving Obamacare, making it less private, the public option, real debt relief, and Biden just did like student debt relief, but it was like also like they went back on it, right? And then marijuana reform, something other than an industry positive climate bill, which they create a bill where it's going to promote the clean energy sector, but then they like give fossil fuel companies like leeway to do whatever they want with the Inflation Reduction Act. And they don't run on these issues, in which there's like huge public opinion showing that they would be very popular with that. They just let it go all the time. And it's just like, this is there's where we talk about the Democrats being part of a class war against the working class, and then there's where we talk about the Democrats being inept. And like, this is like definitely falls into the ineptitude category.
And, I talk about this a lot. We talk about this a lot. And people always say, but the Democrats are a corporate party too. And obviously, I think you and I know that. We've known that longer than most of the people who are telling us that, right? But that doesn't account for all this, because for a couple of things. One, like, a lot of these programs are really popular, like overwhelmingly popular, right? Healthcare reform, marijuana reform, wage increases, all that kind of stuff. I mean, during the pandemic, even though you had Trump's crazies out, with guns in the state house in Michigan and places like that, significant majorities of Americans favored masks and shutdowns and vaccinations. The Democratic Party plays from this position, has actually this position of strength, and immediately throws it away and, goes into this like shell where they're besieged and they have to like take whatever crumbs go their way. They also believed that, all the country wanted was a return to normalcy. Remember Biden, we're going to go back to the old ways. We're going to be bipartisan. We're going to talk, blah, blah, blah. Like, you have this president who's, kind of as the Italians would say, mezzo morto. He's half a corpse, and no, Americans don't want normalcy. Normalcy is gone, right? 2016, I mean, it was gone before that, but 2016 clearly, was the final, stake to it. And so what do? They mirror Republican policies on law and order. Biden brags about giving more money to the police. It doesn't matter. You could give every cop in America $1 million and you're still not going to get the majority of votes from people who take, a great interest in so-called law and order issues. The Democratic Party is currently being attacked like it has been since Nixon ran a law and order campaign in 1968 on these issues, and they're paralyzed. I mean, they should have seen this coming 18 months ago, but yeah, crime rates have gone up, but there are all kinds of mitigating factors for it. They've also started to retrench. Bail reform is a big deal in Texas. All these Texas Republicans are running ads, essentially saying that Beto O'Rourke and Lena Hidalgo, the county judge, and all the Democrats in Texas are going to let every illegal immigrant cross the border. They're going to give them a gun. They're going to let them kill a cop who they've defunded, and then they're going to not even, post bail, and then they're going to be let loose to go out and kill more cops who are even more defunded. And in that, Democratic Party has no response. They ignore it. They pretend like no one said it. Same with inflation, right? There's a lot of reasons for inflation, including corporate profits. Democratic Party won't talk about that, even though most Americans. So in the absence of any kind of resistance or any kind of counter narrative, Republican Party can say whatever it wants. And it says the most batshit insane things, and it goes further and further out because it can. They know that there's no consequence. Hawley and Cruz on January 6th knew there was no consequence for what they did. And this is where we are. This is where we are today. Utterly predictable attacks that have been going on for decades. And the Democrats, they got nothing.
Yeah, and I just want to actually also just talk about the real failure and the real shift that we've seen in the Democratic Party, which is their where they have completely lost the ability to like campaign or even govern on material issues, right? And so this is the big push that we get from the sort of like socialist sort of leaning element in the Democratic Party, where activists and democratic socialists decide to participate in the Democratic Party, and a lot of it is around like material needs and material gain for the working class, and the leadership continues to like undermine that. And we are actually indeed seeing the sort of more like populist right, and these populist right politicians actually doing more on that front than the Democrats, which is what the Democrats have like always framed themselves around.
Yeah. And yet when you have, the biggest obstacles to getting things done in the last couple of years have been two Democratic senators, right? Manchin and Sinema. Now, I don't know what's happened behind the scenes. Biden may have kind of brought them into the White House and offered every carrot and stick imaginable, it's possible. I'm really skeptical that happened. But when the stuff hits the fan, they're not even really going after Manchin and Sinema. They're going after, like you said, Sanders and the squad and people like that, Nancy Pelosi, who mocked them, the Green Dream and all this kind of stuff, Bernie Sanders has gone after Manchin a bit. I think Sinema's a flake and the party knows it, but notice even then the way they treat their so-called apostates. Yeah,
I will say that it was a pretty epic moment when Manchin was trying to get that amendment to the Inflation Reduction Act passed, and which was going to give fossil fuel companies, this fast track on fossil fuel infrastructure projects, things like the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and Sanders basically killed it. And then Manchin, who is, scum, basically accused Sanders of revenge politics on him, which is like pretty much like Manchin's complete MO for like the last 2 years.
Yeah. I think, but by the way, you're listening to the Green and Red podcast. This is Scott and Bob. We're talking today about kind of why the Democrats suck, part 2, following up on our discussion with Noam Chomsky recently, and why the Democrats always punch left. And it's amazing, right? Because Bernie Sanders and AOC are among the more powerless people in Congress, and yet they have this magical power to kind of like Schrodinger's politicians, right? They're simultaneously utterly weak and utterly powerless and have no influence, and at the same time, they're the reason the Democratic Party is falling apart. Something that I said to Scott, and we'll put it up in the I don't know if we can put it in the show notes. We'll put it up when we talk about this episode. I sent him 4 maps that I think are really, really critical because, and they're election maps during the Obama years, and they show state control. One thing Obama did great, he was a genius at it, was running campaigns for Barack Obama. He was elected president twice. He was this rock star politician. One thing Barack Obama didn't give a rat's ass about was getting Democrats elected at any other level. And in in the first time he ran for office, if you look at and we have these maps, there's one which shows party control in states and state legislatures. And in 2000, before the election of 2000, about 2008, you had kind of a fairly equal number. I think actually a few more Democratic states controlled both houses of the state legislature than Republican states did. By 2010, 2012, 2014, it was down to over a 2-to-1 Republican advantage. And after 2016, I think there were like maybe 4 states left that controlled both Democrat, like California obviously is one of them, right? West Virginia was one of them until like 2012 or something like that, right? And now, there are virtually none. So you have, I think, I don't know, something like 30 states where the Republican Party controls. Now that means, what do they control? They control redistricting, they control gerrymandering, they control everything. They can pass the craziest voter registration laws where you're not allowed to hand somebody a glass of water in line, a bottle of water in line, but you can be out there in camo, intimidating the hell out of voters.
Yeah, and we can show the map real quick for the folks on video.
Oh, okay.
For folks who are joining us on YouTube, and for folks on the audio, we'll also put some version of this in the show notes.
Or you can check us out on YouTube too. But there you go. So you have
or you can check us out on YouTube.
So you have the pre-2010 trifectas, right? So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Republican states which control, where the Republicans have control of both houses. And then you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, probably about 12, 14 Democratic states that do. And then 2014. Now, these are the Obama years. Obama. And
notice California is not one of those.
That's right. That was Schwarzenegger was still governor, right? And did the Republicans
pre 2010, Brown got elected in 2010.
Right. And then you see in the Obama years, the Democratic Party put very little effort into down ballot races, and you can see the implications of what that means in 2014. Then 2016, where you're down to 4 states, right? Just a bloodbath. And so this is what we're talking about. And this is, there's the last one there too. So, and again, it's just this abysmal. And so, and that goes along with, and I think the same thing can be said of judicial appointments, right? Obama was abysmal. It's kind of funny. I think we've mentioned this before. Somebody is writing a book about Obama, and he discovered this manuscript that Obama and somebody else wrote in 1990s. Transforming America. It was never published. And in it, it's actually, Obama kind of gets it. He understands what the failure of the Democratic Party is. And one of the points he makes was that the Democrats expected the courts to bail them out. They always figured the courts will bail us out, the courts, Brown v. Board and all this kind of stuff. And so they didn't really organize, and they didn't really put much emphasis or money or resources into legislative contests, especially at the state level. Well, the courts ain't bailing you out anymore. The courts are your sworn enemy. The courts are really an invidious force in all this, right? And Obama didn't take the courts seriously. Rahm Emanuel at one point said, "Who gives a shit about justices or judges or whatever?" So they can't even play that game. And when they stole the Merrick Garland seat, there were Democratic senators telling Obama, just shut the Senate down, shut the government down. He wouldn't do it, right? Wouldn't make a recess appointment. They make a hero out of. Can you imagine if Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a Republican? We've said this how many times? If she were a Republican and she had a diagnosis of cancer and refused to resign, they would have sent her fishing with Al Neri. And many of you know what that reference is. If not, it's easy to figure out, right? And they made a hero out of her.
Godfather episode.
And they still make a freaking hero out of her, right? That was as narcissistic as anything you can find. And they heroicize her. Look at what the Republicans did to Lynn Cheney. Look at what they do to people who voted to impeach Trump. They're all gone. They're muerto, Where the Democrats fucking make you heroes. They put you on stamps and they make documentaries about you and they give you cute little nicknames, right? They have this idea that, politics is based on anger. And it really has been for a while now. It's based on anger. It's based on grievance. It's not based on hope and all that other bullshit. Maybe in 1992, Clinton could get away with that. You can't anymore. And so when you have these people here in Texas, the ads for Greg Abbott basically start in this foreboding doomed music. And it shows this guy breaking, a wall, and it's Beto O'Rourke. Guy kind of looks like Beto O'Rourke from behind. And he's letting all the immigrants in, and he's refusing to make them post bail. And he's doing all these horrible things. And it's just this incredible attack on your senses. It outrages you. It makes you frightened and afraid, right? And all the Republican ads are like this. They are straight to the gut. They're angry. They're terrifying, right? And in turn, right? And so it brings up the worst. And in turn, now on the stump, Beto, kind of lets loose. And he did confront Abbott, after Uvalde, which I thought was really kind of a great look. But Beto's ads are like, they make me cringe because they're like Skippy, I call them. They're like the Boy Scout ads, right? And I think Scott has one queued up. This is just look at the first 10 seconds of it, even.
I don't think Greg Abbott wakes up wanting to see our kids.
Oops.
Shot in their schools, for our property taxes to go up $20 billion, or for the grid to fail. But after 8 years, he's been unable to fix these problems. He's failed us. As governor, I'll protect our kids. I'll pay our teachers. I'll expand Medicaid, I'll lower our property taxes, and I'll fight to make sure every woman makes her own decisions about her own body. I'm asking for your vote. Let's turn the page on Greg Abbott and move Texas forward.
Maybe in 1996 that would have worked, but look at the way he introduced. I don't think Greg Abbott wants to see our kid. I don't think Greg Abbott, I don't want to see Greg. That's exactly what Greg Abbott wants. During the freeze, Republican Party basically said, Texans should be willing to die rather than regulate big oil. Texans should be willing to die rather than have gun control. That's exactly what he says. I don't know why they get this idea that being timid and being nice and reaching out is somehow going to convince people, oh, this is a reasonable alternative. People don't want a reasonable alternative. For years, people have been upset, and I don't know if you get the same thing. Obviously, I'm a bit vociferous, and people have always no, you don't get it. This is like, if you really want to go after the working class community, they articulate things differently. They speak differently. There's a different language. The Democrats are a party now with its core is educated people, right? People with college degrees. They're different. You can't go to Youngstown and do that. You have to go to Youngstown and breathe fire and throw gasoline on the fire, And Trump and his people do that. They run the most in states like Texas, right? But it works. And this is a real problem, at their core, they don't know how to do politics. They just have no concept of how to do politics. The Republicans embrace, not just they embrace Kyle Rittenhouse, right? They're having a field day with the attack on Pelosi's husband. These people aren't going to be reasoned with, and they're not going to, fall for Beto O'Rourke's crocodile tears of his oh, I'm such a nice guy, and Abbott's really not so bad, but it's time to get rid of him, right? The Democratic Party, rejects anything. I mean, obviously Antifa is not even up to question, but they attack, like I said, AOC. Imagine that. You have one party embracing Rittenhouse. You have a party embracing violent attacks. You have a party embracing Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And then the other party makes Al Franken leave the Senate, makes Katie Hill leave Congress. It's Darth Vader against Elmo,
Yeah, it's, and to go back to what I started with, is there's partially not a militant mass movement because of this sort of suppression all the time. And, where the leadership won't even let the more activist, left-leaning members of the party even have a say on things, which would bring, which would be of material value to the working class and the middle class, things like Medicare for all, free college, the Green New Deal, all of that is their existence is to smother their activist base, while the Republicans fuel their activist base. I think it says a lot. They are in many ways the true party of the 1%.
Yeah,
not that the Republicans aren't, but
yeah, no, and I mean, even the stuff you mentioned isn't terribly. I mean, it's not the most progressive stuff. The Green New Deal, yeah, it's better than what you got, but it's utterly insufficient for the problems we face. And even then,
LBJ and the Great Society is more to the left, and a lot of the programs are being put up by the left
oh,
wing of
absolutely.
the,
I
of the
mean,
Democratic
if you look
Party.
at the kind of their core political ideas, Eisenhower and Nixon, would be firmly within kind of probably the progressive wing of it. I mean, they accepted the idea of unions and stuff like that. I mean, they clearly moved their parties to the right, but I mean, not like these cats today. But yeah, in the absence of any kind of resistance or performative resistance, the rejection of any kind of class politics, you cede the entire field so that in 2016, and this is really critical because liberals to this day, and first of all, their strategy to this day, every liberal I know attacks Trump's voters. They're idiots, they're stupid, they're racist, they're bigots. A lot of them are irredeemable. I kind of gave up myself, but the reality is it's probably not the best way to approach people by saying you're a fucking idiot and you're a racist and you're a bigot. But in 2016, two of the biggest factors in Trump's victories, especially in those industrial states, was it Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, right? Areas that had been affected by NAFTA and China, areas that perceive themselves as being affected by NAFTA and China, losing jobs and so forth. That was the difference. That's why Trump won. They provided enough votes in those industrial states to put Trump over the top, because Trump went to Youngstown like 6 times in 2016 and kept telling these steel workers, these pissed off steel workers, I care about you and I'm going to bring these factories back and I love you. It was bullshit. They knew it was bullshit. They had to, right? But he did it. Hillary Clinton didn't do that. Hillary Clinton and her husband brought them NAFTA, right? So, the Republican Party, they're not full of evil geniuses, but they had enough sense to go there and lie to these people, and it worked. And in turn, you have the left, with this hysterical, unhinged, there's a coup, it's the Paul Street syndrome. It's just, those people are damaging the left. People who think that electoral politics is all you have to do is damaging. People who go after Republicans. Republicans are irredeemable. Like, you need sit-ins at Pelosi's office. Didn't AOC do one of those when she first
With the Sunrise Movement? Yeah, she went.
And
the
then that was the last of that, right? But you need to go after them.
Yep. Probably getting towards the end of our time. Do you have any final things you want to say?
I have so many final thoughts on this.
We'll probably do more. We'll probably do a post-election show too.
Yeah, I mean, it's barring some last minute bizarro world thing. Next week's going to be ugly, and most of these people, are running shit. I mean, the person I feel sorry for, actually, and he's not a terribly progressive candidate by any means, is Tim Ryan in Ohio, who's actually run a really good campaign, and he's talked about these issues, but like the rest of the country's Republican parties, the Ohio Republicans are under Trump's thumb. And so you have JD Vance, who's not a popular guy. Ryan is actually way more popular than Vance, but Ryan's going to lose. And that's too bad, because he's actually run one of the better campaigns I've seen a Democrat run in a while. Not ideal, not necessarily progressive even, but, enough that he brought up some issues that I think the Democratic Party should be bringing up. But other than that, I think it's going to be ugly, and they'll punch left again, and you're going to see, Biden's last 2 years are going to be utterly paralyzed. You're going to have a million different committees investigating him and Hunter Biden's laptop and all that kind of shit. So buckle up. It's going to get even choppier.
Yep. One last thing that we wanted to touch on. We lost someone important to both Bob and I last week. Mike Davis, writer, political organizer, student for a Democratic Society, historian who was based in Southern California. He penned prescient works like City of Quartz, Ecology of Fear, The Monster at Our Door, The Global Threat of the Avian Flu. He passed away from cancer last week on October 25th. And we're actually planning to hopefully do a bigger show on Mike, but we just wanted to kind of like not do a new episode without like saying something about Mike. I will read this one excerpt from an obituary that came out on him recently, which I thought was pretty touching. It said, unlike the rest of the new left, Mike didn't reject the old left. His mentor in the 1960s and 70s was the renegade Communist Party leader in Southern California, Dorothy Healy. Mike loved arguing with her. When Dorothy died in 2006, Mike wrote in The Nation that she represented the left's greatest generation, Those tough as nails children of Ellis Island who built the CIO, fought Jim Crow in Manhattan and Alabama, and buried their friends in the Spanish earth. Their deaths, he said, were an inestimable, heart-wrenching loss. Now we feel the same about him.
Yeah, Mike Davis was a fighter. He was a partisan. That's a word I've been using a lot lately, a partisan. He wasn't content with faculty lounge jargon. He wasn't content to, make himself famous, like a lot of left media do today, a lot of left intellectuals do today. Although he felt comfortable. Toward the end, he did a lot of podcasts and talks, which I'd encourage everybody to look at and to read. His classic is probably City of Courts, which is a history of Los Angeles. Just a stand-up guy. I only met him once, but he was incredibly gracious and supportive of a young scholar at the time. And just a union guy, a guy who'd been in the streets, a member of the Communist Party, just a real partisan who wasn't above the fray and the kind of iffy, way that a lot of people are. So it's not just and intellectually just a giant. I was talking to a friend the other day who actually took courses with him at UC Davis, and I said the one thing that always really impressed me the most about Davis was he was able to just kind of take all these interrelated, or not actually, seemingly disparate ideas and interrelate them. So he could pull something like climate change, and he could pull pandemics, and he could talk about poverty and gangs and create this kind of cohesive web, right? And I said to my friend, it's like, I wonder if he ever read the Bradel. Fernand Bradel was this French historian who wrote this like 6-volume history of the Mediterranean, where he brought all this together. And then I was reading an obituary the other day where it said he was influenced by Bradel. Davis does that as well as anybody. And that, I think, is the incredible value, where he shows like how everything's interconnected. Like Planet of Slums is just one of the more depressing books you're ever going to read. But it's incredible the way he can go to like Jakarta one minute and Rio the next minute and Chicago. And he brings all this together. And pretty soon you're looking at these interconnected webs of often materialist politics. He wrote about Marx extensively. Just a brilliant scholar, a stand-up guy, and a partisan. And the left clearly is not the same without him.
Yeah, so Mike Davis, rest in power, presente. And I think we'll close with that today. Everyone take care, and we'll talk to you again soon. Fight and organize.
Only see it on TV, read it in the magazines. Celebrities and want sympathy. All they do is piss and moan inside the Rolling Stones, talking about a hard life can be. I'd like to see them spend the week living life out on the street. I don't think they would survive, but they can spend a day or two walking in someone else's shoes. I think they stumble and they fall. They would fall. Whoa. Lifestyles, solutions are famous. They're always complaining, always complaining. If money is such a problem, well, they got mansions. Think we should rob them. Well, if you do when you're famous, you kill your wife. There's no such thing as 25 to life, as long as you got the cash to pay for Cochrane. And did you know if you were caught, you were smoking crack? McDonald's even wouldn't even want to take you back. You could always run for mayor of DC. I'd like to see them spend a week living life out on the street. I don't think they could survive. They could spend a day or two walking in someone else's shoes. I think they'd stumble and they'd fall. They would fall. Lifestyles of the rich and the famous. They're always complaining, always complaining. If money is such a problem, well, they got mansions. Think we should rob them. closing cursing resolutions raining. Last time, something big, famous. Last time.